What if you woke up in a hospital bed and everyone around you insisted you were never alive? Daniel's eyes opened to darkness, but it wasn't the kind of darkness that belonged to night. It was heavy, stale, the kind of darkness that clings to forgotten places, broken only by the sickly pulse of a fluorescent bulb overhead. The bulb buzzed faintly, like a trapped insect rattling against glass, and its unsteady glow illuminated the room in fragments. One moment, shadows pooled thick in every corner, swallowing the edges of the world. The next, pale light splashed across peeling walls and exposed the rot that had spread like infection. It was as if the room didn't want him to see it all at once, as if it wanted him to discover its horrors in flickering pieces. He inhaled sharply, and regret filled his lungs. The air was wrong, stale, damp, thick with mold. The coppery tang of rust clung to the back of his tongue, and underneath it all was a faint sweetness, like flowers that had been left in water long after their beauty had withered. The smell made his stomach twist. It was the odor of something long abandoned, left to fester. Daniel shifted and realized he was lying on a bed, though calling it that seemed generous. The mattress beneath him was thin and uneven, its springs groaning with every movement. The metal frame creaked like an old ship tossed in waves, a sound that echoed unnervingly in the silence. He sat up slowly, his muscles sluggish, his head pounding with a dull, relentless ache, as though he had been asleep far too long. The room was painted a sickly pale green, though much of the color had peeled away in jagged strips, leaving the concrete wall exposed. Water stains bled down from the ceiling, spreading in grotesque, Rorschach-like shapes that resembled faces mid-scream. He stared too long at one of them, and for a fleeting second he swore it blinked back at him. He tore his gaze away, his breath quickening. Across from him, a heavy iron door loomed. Its surface was scarred with scratches, gouges, and patches of rust that had bloomed outward like disease. The door stood slightly ajar, as though whoever left had forgotten to shut it fully, or perhaps hadn't wanted to. Beyond, the hallway stretched into darkness, a long throat of cracked tiles and shadow. Daniel strained his ears. The silence was suffocating, but not complete. Somewhere beyond that doorway came the faint sound of water dripping, slow, rhythmic, steady as a heartbeat. Drip, drip, drip. It was a sound that might have been comforting in another place, but here it made him feel trapped inside a body too still, a tomb too quiet. His throat was painfully dry. He licked his lips, and the simple act made him feel strangely alive. Needing reassurance, he whispered into the stale air, his voice hoarse and fragile. "Where am I?" The question lingered, unanswered, and the silence pressed harder against him, as if the building itself was holding its breath. That's when he saw the nightstand. It sat to his right, a squat, rusted thing with one drawer half open. On top of it rested a medical chart, its once white paper now yellowed with age, the edges curled and brittle. His pulse quickened as he reached for it. He didn't know why he was afraid of the contents, only that some part of him already understood it wouldn't bring comfort. The first line was printed in clean, typewritten letters. Name, Dr. Daniel Cole. His heart skipped. He frowned. Doctor? The word rang in his head with a hollow echo. That wasn't right. He wasn't a doctor. He stopped. He couldn't finish the thought. He tried to dig through the fog in his memory, but every detail slipped away like water through cupped hands. He could see flashes, a highway slick with rain, headlights cutting through the dark, his own breath fogging against glass. But before that, nothing. His eyes crawled further down the page, and his blood turned to ice. Date of death, August 3rd, 1995. Cause, cardiac arrest. The words seared into him. For a moment, the paper seemed to tremble in his hands, or maybe it was just him shaking. His chest tightened until it felt like an iron band was clamped around his ribs. He read it again. Then again, the words didn't change. According to this chart, he had died nearly 30 years ago. The chart slipped from his fingers and landed on the floor with a brittle flutter. Daniel staggered to his feet, his legs weak, his breath shallow. Panic roared through him, overwhelming, primal. He pressed a hand to his chest, half expecting to feel nothing, half expecting to confirm the impossible truth. But his heart hammered furiously beneath his palm, loud, insistent, alive. A sound cut through his spiraling thoughts. Footsteps, soft, deliberate, echoing faintly down the hallway. Daniel's head snapped toward the iron door. A faint glow shimmered beyond it, broken by the silhouette of someone approaching. He staggered back as the door groaned open with a drawn-out shriek. A woman stepped inside. Her presence filled the room like a tide. She wore a crisp white nurse's uniform, her cap perfectly perched on neatly pinned dark hair. Her face was striking but unnervingly still, her expression calm to the point of unnaturalness, like porcelain sculpted into the shape of a smile. "Good evening, Daniel," she said softly. Her voice was low, melodic, almost hypnotic. "It's time for your treatment." Daniel froze. His lips parted, but no sound came. His throat was sandpaper. Finally, he forced out a hoarse whisper. "My treatment? What are you talking about? What is this place? I'm not supposed to be here." The nurse tilted her head slightly, a smile tugging faintly at her lips. "You've always been here." Two figures stepped into the room behind her. Men, dressed in orderly uniforms. Their postures were rigid, their faces expressionless, their eyes glassy and fixed. They stood like mannequins awaiting instruction, still as death. Daniel's pulse thundered in his ears. He stumbled backward until his legs hit the bed frame. No, this is wrong. You've got the wrong man." The nurse's smile deepened as she moved closer. That's when he saw it. The flickering fluorescent light above sputtered again, casting their figures starkly against the floor. The nurse stood in the center of the glow. The orderlies loomed at her sides, but none of them cast shadows. Not a single line, not even the faintest smudge beneath their feet. The light touched them but did not claim them. Daniel's breath hitched violently. "You're not real," he whispered. His voice broke on the words. The nurse leaned closer until her face hovered inches from his. Her breath was cold against his cheek, like air exhaled from a crypt. Her eyes never wavered as she whispered, her voice steady, unyielding. "Neither are you." The world seemed to lurch sideways. Daniel's vision blurred, the room spinning in jagged flashes of light and shadow. The bulb overhead hummed louder, flickering like a dying heartbeat. He gasped, his chest heaving, his hands clawing at the bed as if the rusted frame could anchor him against what she had said. But nothing could stop the words from sinking into him, hollowing him out from the inside. If they weren't real, if he wasn't real, then what was he? The nurse's words clung to him like a sickness. "Neither are you." They echoed inside his skull long after the figures had retreated, their soundless footsteps dissolving into the dark corridor. The room felt colder without them, but not safer, never safer. Daniel sat hunched on the bed, his hands gripping the rusted frame so tightly that flecks of rust flaked away beneath his nails. He tried to convince himself that he was dreaming, that this was some elaborate hallucination conjured by fever or exhaustion. But the metallic taste in his mouth, the ache in his limbs, and the thundering of his heart were all too real. He forced himself to move. His body resisted, as if the air itself had thickened around him, but he pushed through it. Each step sent a protest up his legs, every joint stiff as though he hadn't used them in years. He bent down, picked up the chart from the floor, and shoved it back onto the nightstand. He couldn't bear to look at it again. Not yet. The iron door loomed open, its jagged rust stains glinting in the weak light. Beyond, the hallway yawned like a throat waiting to swallow him whole. For a moment he thought about staying in the room, curling into the mattress and closing his eyes until morning, if morning even existed here. but a suffocating certainty pressed against him. Staying would be worse. He couldn't explain how he knew, only that something in his bones insisted the room wasn't meant for survival. Daniel stepped through the door. The hallway stretched long and narrow, lined with pale green tiles cracked like old porcelain. Pieces of the ceiling had collapsed in places, littering the floor with plaster chunks and dust. Rusted wheelchairs sat abandoned against the walls, one with its seat torn open, stuffing protruding like entrails. The faint drip of water echoed somewhere far off, steady and endless. He moved slowly, his footsteps unnaturally loud against the silence. His ears strained for the sound of movement, for voices, for anything that might break the stillness. But every corner of this place seemed to be listening back as though waiting for him to speak first. He passed door after door, most of them sealed shut with locks that looked older than he was. Through one cracked window, he glimpsed a dark room filled with overturned gurneys and shattered glass. Another revealed rows of empty cribs, each lined up neatly, each rocking slightly though no air stirred. His stomach twisted, and he quickened his pace. Something shifted in the darkness ahead. He froze, heart hammering, eyes locked on the shadows. The light flickered overhead, stuttering, and in that fractured glow he thought he saw a figure standing at the far end of the hall. Tall, motionless, watching. "Hello?" His voice broke, echoing off the walls in brittle fragments. The figure didn't move. The light sputtered again, and when it steadied, the hallway was empty. Daniel stumbled back a step, his breath ragged. He rubbed his eyes, forcing himself to breathe. Hallucination, stress, nothing more. But even as he told himself that, his chest throbbed with unease. He turned a corner and his eyes caught on a corkboard mounted crookedly on the wall. Its surface was cluttered with faded photographs pinned in neat rows. He stepped closer, drawn despite the prickling dread crawling up his spine. The photographs showed patients, men, women, children, all wearing the same pale gowns. Their eyes were hollow, their expressions drained. Some stood in groups, others alone, but all of them shared one unsettling detail. Their faces were blurred, as if the film had decayed only in those spots. The outlines of their bodies remained sharp, but where their eyes and mouths should have been were smudges of gray nothingness. Daniel's hands trembled as he scanned the board, and then his stomach dropped. One of the blurred faces looked eerily familiar. The curve of the jaw, the slope of the shoulders, it could have been him. He leaned closer, his breath fogging the glass, and a sick realization crawled through his chest. Several of the blurred figures bore the same resemblance. Not just one. Dozens. Every row, every year, it was as though the same man kept reappearing in the photographs, dressed in different gowns, standing in different rooms, surrounded by different people. His knees went weak. He staggered back, bile rising in his throat. A whisper brushed the air. At first he thought it was the sound of the leaking pipe again, but this was different, softer, human, curling at the edge of hearing. He froze, straining his ears. "Daniel." His blood turned to ice. The voice was faint, disembodied, carried through the hall like a secret meant only for him. He spun around, scanning the corridor. Empty. "Daniel." It came again, closer this time, slipping between the dripping water and the hum of the failing lights. It was neither male nor female, but layered, as though dozens of voices spoke his name at once. "Who's there?" His voice cracked, the sound pathetic against the weight of the silence. No reply. The lights flickered violently, plunging him into near-total darkness before snapping back. For a split second he saw movement at the far end of the corridor. Shapes shifting, figures slipping just out of sight. And then the chanting began. Low at first, almost inaudible, but building. Dozens of voices, whispering his name in unison. "Daniel. Daniel. Daniel." The sound came from everywhere and nowhere, reverberating through the walls, seeping up through the floor, vibrating in his skull. His hands flew to his ears, but it made no difference. The voices were inside him now. He staggered forward, desperate to outrun them, his breath ragged and shallow. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, doors blurring past, the light above him flickering like lightning. The voices grew louder, urgent, insistent. "Daniel, they'll come back. Daniel, remember." His legs buckled, and he slammed against the wall, scraping his arm against cracked tile. The pain was sharp, grounding, but it didn't stop the chant. He pressed his forehead against the cold wall, squeezing his eyes shut, praying for silence. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the chanting stopped. Daniel gasped, his chest heaving, his ears ringing in the abrupt stillness. The silence pressed in again, thicker than before, almost alive. He opened his eyes slowly, dreading what he might see. The hallway was empty, but scrawled across the wall in dripping black letters that hadn't been there before was a single word: remember. The word on the wall dripped as though freshly painted, each dark streak sliding downward like blood refusing to dry. Remember. Daniel staggered back from it, his pulse pounding in his throat, a sour taste rising in his mouth. He wanted to deny it, to scream that there was nothing to remember, but the word pulsed with a strange familiarity, as if the walls themselves knew a secret his mind had buried. He forced his gaze away and pressed forward, deeper into the bowels of the hospital. The corridor bent into unfamiliar territory, narrowing as though the building itself was closing in around him. The air thickened, warmer now, saturated with the smell of mildew and something sharper, like burnt hair. Every breath scraped his lungs, and still he walked, unable to stop. It felt less like a choice, and more like an unseen tether pulling him forward. The doors along this stretch were different. Their plaques were tarnished, but faint engravings remained. Ward A, Ward B, Ward C. Each bore a symbol carved beneath the lettering, crude yet deliberate. A circle split by jagged lines, a spiral that tightened until it vanished, an eye that seemed to watch even in the dark. His fingers brushed against one as he passed, and the cold that shot through him was so intense he snatched his hand away as though burned. A sound interrupted his thoughts. Faint, muffled voices. Not the disembodied whispers from before, but real voices. Human, clustered together somewhere nearby. Daniel's chest tightened with a surge of conflicting emotions. Relief at the thought of finding others. Dread at what kind of others might be waiting. He followed the noise, pressing his palm against the wall for balance as the floor sloped unevenly beneath his feet. The voices grew louder, carrying fragments of words, laughter, sobbing. The sound was wrong, overlapping in chaotic layers, as though every person spoke a different thought at once. He stopped before a wide double door. The glass panes were smeared with grime, but shapes shifted behind them, figures moving in restless circles. His throat went dry. He reached for the handle, his hand trembling, and pushed. The door creaked open with a groan that echoed through the chamber. Inside, dozens of patients milled about. Some sat hunched in rusted wheelchairs, rocking slowly. Others paced, their bare feet slapping the tiles. A few stood motionless in corners, staring at the walls as though waiting for them to speak. Every one of them wore the same pale gown. Their skin was sallow, stretched tight over bone, their eyes dark and sunken. But when Daniel entered, every head turned. The room fell silent. Dozens of eyes locked onto him. He froze in the doorway, the weight of their collective gaze pressing against his chest until he could barely breathe. One of them, an older man with a crooked spine, shuffled forward. His lips parted, cracked and bleeding at the corners, and in a voice hoarse with disuse he whispered, "You came back." Daniel's stomach lurched. What do you mean?" His words felt clumsy, intrusive in the oppressive stillness. The man's eyes glittered with something between reverence and fear. "You left us, but you always come back. The walls remember. We remember." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "He remembers. He doesn't remember. He left us. He made us. Daniel shook his head violently. No, I'm not supposed to be here. I don't even know this place. His voice cracked, the desperation leaking through. A woman rose from a bench near the back, her movements sharp and unnatural, like a marionette tugged by unseen strings. Her hair hung in clumps over her face, but her eyes burned through the strands. She stepped closer, pointing a trembling finger at him. "You're not a patient." Her voice rang louder, more certain. "You never were." The words slammed into him like a physical blow. The other patients stirred, nodding, muttering in agreement. Not one of us. Their voices layered, building into a chant that clawed at his sanity. Daniel's breath came fast and shallow. "If I'm not a patient, then what am I?" The woman tilted her head, and for a moment the entire room seemed to lean with her. "You were the one who opened the doors. You brought us here. You made the rules." "No." His voice cracked again, but even as he denied it, a sickly sensation gnawed at him. The way the halls seemed familiar, the photographs with faces blurred like his own. The words scrawled on the wall. "Remember." The old man reached forward, his trembling hand brushing Daniel's sleeve. The touch sent an electric jolt up his arm, a sensation of memory sparking at the edge of his mind. Images flashed, shadows of operating tables, the glint of surgical tools, the smell of burned flesh. A scream, his own, or someone else's, echoed through his skull. He yanked his arm away, stumbling back. "Stop! I don't know you! I don't know this place!" But the patients pressed closer, surrounding him now, their hollow eyes wide with something like worship. "You do?" They whispered in unison, their voices blending into one monstrous chorus. "You do. You do." The woman stepped closer, her face inches from his. Her breath was cold, her words deliberate. "You are not a patient, Daniel. You are the doctor." The word cracked open something inside him. For a heartbeat, he saw himself not in a gown, but in a white coat stained with dark blotches. He saw his hands not trembling but steady, guiding a scalpel across pale skin. He heard his own voice speaking calmly as someone begged him to stop. He stumbled back, clutching his skull as if he could crush the memory before it fully formed. "No, that's not me. That's not me." The patients didn't move. They only watched, their faces twisted in expectation. From the back of the room, a child's voice broke the silence. High, trembling, but unmistakable. "Dr. Daniel." The crowd parted. A small boy stepped forward, his gown dragging along the floor, his face half hidden in shadow. He stared up at Daniel with eyes too old for his body. "You promised you wouldn't leave us again." The child's voice lingered in the air long after the boy had spoken, hanging there like smoke that refused to disperse. "Dr. Daniel." The name wrapped around his ears with a weight he didn't want to carry, and yet his chest tightened as if it had always been his. The patient stared at him with wide, sunken eyes, their silence louder than screams. Daniel's legs weakened under their scrutiny, his breath ragged, sweat soaking through the thin hospital gown. He wanted to argue, to shout that they were wrong, but the boy's eyes locked him in place. They were too sharp, too knowing for a child. The boy didn't blink, didn't even tremble. His stare was a verdict. "I don't know you," Daniel whispered, though his voice betrayed his doubt. His throat constricted, his words dry. "I'm not your doctor." The boy tilted his head, and the motion seemed to ripple through the entire crowd of patients, as if their bodies were tethered to his. "You promised," the child repeated softly. "You promised you wouldn't leave us again." The chant began before Daniel could react. Dozens of voices layered over one another, soft at first, but quickly rising. "You promised! You promised! You promised!" The words slammed into him like a wave, surrounding him, drowning him in their rhythm. Then the crowd surged forward. Hands, cold and skeletal, clamped around his arms, his shoulders, his chest. He screamed, thrashing, but their grip was iron. They lifted him, carried him like a sacrifice through the ward, his feet dragging helplessly across the tiles. The boy followed behind, silent, his gaze never leaving Daniel. They carried him into a room at the far end of the hall. The door was heavy, reinforced with thick iron bands, and when it swung open, the stench of electricity and charred fabric hit him like a fist. The treatment room. It was cavernous, its walls lined with cabinets of rusted instruments and shattered glass jars. In the center stood a chair bolted to the floor, its leather straps cracked but still strong, its headpiece crowned with wires and electrodes that snaked upward into a humming generator. The light above flickered, casting the room in bursts of sickly yellow and suffocating darkness. "No!" Daniel kicked, struggled, begged, as they dragged him toward the chair. "I'm not him. I'm not your doctor." His voice cracked under the pressure, but the patients didn't falter. Their strength was inhuman, their grip unyielding. They forced him down, the cold leather biting into his back, the straps wrapping around his wrists and ankles. He fought, but the more he resisted, the tighter they pulled until the buckles cut into his skin. His chest rose and fell in frantic bursts, and the smell of rust and ozone filled his nostrils. The boy approached the console beside the chair. His small hands reached for the switches with a precision that chilled Daniel more than anything else. He had done this before. He knew how it worked. Daniel thrashed against the restraints, his voice breaking. "Please, don't do this. I'm not who you think I am. I don't remember any of this." The boy looked at him, and for the first time, Daniel saw sorrow in his face. But it was not pity. It was disappointment. "That's what you always say." The words hit Daniel like a blade to the gut. He froze as the boy flipped a switch. The generator roared to life, its low hum vibrating through the floor, through the chair, through his bones. The electrodes hissed, sparking faintly, casting sharp shadows across the room. And then, as if triggered by the current, Daniel's mind convulsed. Memories, shards, not whole, ripped through him. He saw white walls lit by surgical lamps. He saw hands, his own hands, steady, gloved, holding a scalpel. He saw faces stretched in agony, mouths open in silent screams. He saw ink blotting patient charts, his signature scrawled beneath words like procedure and failure. No, that's not me," he howled, straining against the straps. But even as he denied it, the images kept coming, clearer, heavier. A clipboard, notes in his handwriting, the patient's numbers, not names. The boy's face, smaller, frailer, under a glaring bulb as Daniel adjusted a dial on the machine. The current surged through the wires. Sparks spat, the chair rattled, and Daniel screamed, not from pain, but from the memories detonating inside him. He remembered corridors echoing with wails. He remembered promises made to patients, promises of cures that never came. He remembered the silence after their screams stopped. And then, another image, a mirror. His reflection in a white coat, the coat splattered with something dark and wet. He didn't look horrified. He looked calm, focused. A man who believed what he was doing mattered. The generator shut down suddenly, the hum fading into silence. Daniel slumped in the chair, gasping, sweat pouring down his face, his body trembling. The straps cut into his skin, but he no longer fought them. He stared at the cracked mirror across the room. And there he was. Not the hospital gown, not the frightened, broken man he thought he was. The reflection showed a doctor in a stained white coat, a stethoscope around his neck, a clipboard in his hand, and on the pocket of the coat, embroidered in dark letters, the name, Dr. Daniel Holloway. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. His own reflection smiled faintly at him, something his real face could not. The boy stepped closer to the chair, his voice no louder than a whisper. "Now do you remember, doctor?" The room was silent except for Daniel's ragged breathing, the straps digging into his wrists as he stared at the reflection in the cracked mirror. The doctor's coat, the name stitched into the pocket, the faint curl of a smile that didn't belong to him, but to the man in the glass. He tried to deny it, to pull his gaze away, but the reflection held him fast like a predator pinning its prey. The boy's words echoed in his skull. "Now do you remember, Doctor?" Daniel's throat was raw, his voice reduced to a whisper. "That's not me, I couldn't have." His chest convulsed with each word, yet deep down, a pressure built, an ache like a locked door rattling inside his mind, ready to burst. The patients moved as one. They loosened the straps, their fingers cold as they unbuckled him from the chair, but their grip didn't soften. They lifted him from the seat and carried him back through the winding halls. His legs dragged across the floor, his own strength useless against their collective will. The boy walked ahead, leading them deeper into the asylum, past corridors Daniel hadn't seen before. Corridors that felt older, rotting, like they had been buried for decades beneath layers of time. Finally, they arrived at a wide chamber. The door was massive, iron hinges groaning as it swung open. Inside was a hall that might once have been a chapel, though whatever faith it belonged to had long since rotted away. The pews were broken, scattered like bones. The stained glass windows were blackened with soot, the colored shards dulled into lifeless gray. At the far end stood what resembled a judge's bench, carved from cracked stone, its edges jagged as teeth. The patients filled the pews, their movements eerily synchronized as though rehearsed. Daniel was dragged to the center of the hall and thrown onto his knees. Dust plumed around him, stinging his eyes, but when he blinked it away, he saw them, shadows gathering in the corners of the chamber. They weren't cast by the patients. No, the patients still had no shadows at all. These were separate entities, shifting forms of darkness that clung to the walls and ceiling, writhing like smoke given shape. Their presence carried weight, and Daniel felt it pressing against his chest, suffocating him. The boy climbed the stone steps to the bench and stood atop it, his small frame dwarfed by the jagged throne. When he spoke, his voice was not entirely his own. It carried echoes, dozens of them, layered and distorted, as though every patient spoke through him. "Dr. Daniel Holloway," the boy intoned, his eyes burning with pale light. "You stand accused." Daniel's stomach lurched. Accused? Of what? His voice cracked, desperate. The crowd erupted in whispers, a wave of sound that built until it became unbearable. The boy raised his hand and silence fell instantly. He stared down at Daniel with the weight of centuries. Of cruelty, of lies, of playing God with the broken and the lost. You called it treatment. You called it research. We called it torment. Daniel shook his head violently. No, I couldn't have done those things. But even as the words left his lips, flashes surged through his mind. The scalpel in his hand, the screams echoing off tiled walls, his voice soothing, calm, as he whispered promises of healing, promises that ended in silence. The boy gestured, and one of the shadows peeled itself from the wall. It slithered across the floor, solidifying as it approached Daniel. When it stopped, it formed into a patient's body, a man whose face was half charred, his eyes hollow sockets. He pointed a blackened finger at Daniel. "You strapped me down," the figure hissed, voice like burning paper. "You told me the shocks would make me whole. You said I'd forget the fire, but all I remember is burning." Daniel stumbled backward, but the crowd behind him pushed him forward again. His knees scraped against the stone. "No, I didn't." Another shadow stepped forth. A woman, her arms covered in needle marks, her veins traced in black lines. Her lips trembled as she spoke. "You said it would calm the voices. You said the serum would quiet them, but it only made them louder." Her eyes rolled back, her jaw snapping open as a dozen voices shrieked from her throat at once. Daniel's skin went cold, his heartbeat hammering. He turned to the boy, pleading. "I didn't know. I didn't mean for it to..." The boy's eyes narrowed. "You always say that." More shadows emerged, one after another, until the hall was filled with a tribunal of horrors. Each one spoke of experiments, of needles and blades, of nights strapped to beds where the lights never turned off. Their voices overlapped, a chorus of accusation that shook the very walls. Daniel covered his ears, but the sound crawled under his skin, vibrating through his bones. Finally, the boy raised his hand again. The chamber fell silent. His voice rang out, heavy with judgment. "You died 30 years ago, Doctor. Your heart failed in this very room. In the middle of a procedure you refused to end. You thought death would free you." He leaned forward, his pale eyes burning into Daniel's. "But death doesn't erase guilt. It binds it." Daniel's vision swam. He tried to rise, to run, but his body refused him. The crowd pressed closer, their hollow eyes blazing with expectation. The boy pointed at him like a judge passing sentence. "You will face what we faced. You will feel what we felt. And when dawn comes, you will forget again, only to relive it. Over and over. For eternity." Daniel's breath hitched, his body trembling as he fell back onto his hands. No, please. I can't." The boy's voice dropped to a whisper, sharp as a blade. "Your trial is over. Now comes the judgment." And as he spoke, the shadow surged forward, engulfing Daniel in a wave of black. The darkness swallowed him whole. Daniel flailed in the void, his hands clawing at nothing, his lungs screaming for air that wasn't there. It was thick, suffocating, like drowning in tar. Yet within the shadows, shapes stirred. Cold hands brushed against his skin, skeletal fingers tracing his arms, his throat, his face. He tried to scream, but the void choked the sound, dragging it back into him until he thought his chest would burst. Then the shadows receded all at once, spilling him onto the cold floor of another room. He coughed violently, gasping, clutching his stomach as bile burned his throat. The air here was different, sterile, metallic, sharp with the bite of chemicals. Slowly, he lifted his head. The room was an operating theater. Floodlights hung from the ceiling, glaring white and merciless. Metal trays lined the counters, gleaming with surgical instruments that looked freshly polished despite the layers of dust everywhere else. Scalpels, clamps, long needles. An IV stand swayed slightly, its empty bag dripping with something black that wasn't liquid but shadows themselves. In the center stood a hospital bed bolted to the floor, its straps spread wide like a starfish waiting to bind a body. For a long moment, Daniel couldn't breathe because he knew this room. He remembered it, not from now, but from then, his hands adjusting the light, his voice telling a patient to hold still, the click of leather buckles as he tightened restraints. "No." His whisper barely carried, trembling. He staggered back against the wall, bile burning his throat again. The patients surrounded him now, lining the perimeter of the theater. They stood silent, statuesque, their hollow eyes fixed on him. At their center, the boy approached, holding a clipboard. The wood was splintered, the papers yellowed and smeared. But Daniel recognized the handwriting scrawled across the top. His handwriting. The boy's voice carried no inflection, no malice, no pity, only verdict. "You will receive what you gave, Doctor." The crowd surged forward. Their hands closed on him, dragging him toward the bed. He kicked, twisted, begged, his voice shattering in desperation. "No, I was trying to help. I didn't mean to hurt you, I didn't mean..." The words died as they slammed him down onto the mattress. The straps buckled shut around his wrists and ankles, cold leather biting into his skin. He thrashed, but the bonds tightened, pinning him. His chest heaved against the final strap, pulled tight across his ribs. Above him, the lights flared brighter, blinding him. Shadows leaned over, their faces too close. Faces of those he remembered only in fragments. Burned skin, hollow sockets, lips torn from screaming too long. Their mouths opened, but instead of sound, Daniel heard the echoes of his own voice, calm, clinical, detached. "This will only sting for a moment." "No," he rasped, shaking his head violently. "That wasn't me. That wasn't me." The boy placed the clipboard on the counter and selected an instrument from the tray. A long needle, its tip glinting under the light. He handed it to one of the patients, a woman with trembling fingers, and she stepped forward. Her face was a ruined mask of scars, but her eyes burned with a hunger Daniel had never seen. He screamed as the needle slid into his arm, fire searing through his veins. The black liquid spread like ink in water, and with it came memories. Not his current ones, but the memories of those strapped here before him. He felt the fire of electricity coursing through their skulls. He felt the weight of the straps as they begged for release. He felt the despair of promises whispered in lies. Every experiment, every cruelty he had forgotten came flooding into him. Not from his perspective, but from theirs. He convulsed, choking on sobs, his body writhing under the leather straps. The crowd leaned closer, their eyes glittering with vindication. He gasped, his voice raw. Please, I was wrong. I shouldn't have. I didn't know." The boy leaned over him, his pale face expressionless, but his voice carried the weight of every patient at once. "You knew. You always knew." The generator in the corner groaned to life. The electrodes above his head sparked, and a surge of terror shot through Daniel. He remembered now, fully. This machine had been his creation, his cure. He had strapped patients down, placed the crown of wires onto their heads, and thrown the switch while promising salvation. He had watched their bodies convulse, insisting the pain was progress. And now, the crown lowered toward his skull. Daniel screamed, thrashing until the leather cut into his flesh. "No, not me, please, not me!" The metal touched his temples. Cold. Final. The world shattered in a burst of white as the current tore through him. His body arched against the bed, every muscle locked, every nerve screaming. The patients' faces blurred into streaks of light as the pain carved him apart. He smelled burning flesh, his flesh. His vision shook, and in that chaos, fragments of his past life flashed again. His voice soothing a patient as he reached for the dial, his hand steady on the switch, the calmness in his chest as they writhed. And then, his own face, reflected in their wide, terrified eyes. The pain ended as suddenly as it began. He sagged against the straps, smoke curling from his skin, his chest heaving with shallow gasps. His vision swam in and out of focus. The boy stood over him, clipboard in hand, watching silently. Daniel's lips trembled. His voice was barely a croak. "Please, let me go. I can change. I'll make it right." The boy tilted his head, his pale eyes glinting. "There is no right. There is only the cycle." Daniel's heart plummeted. "Cycle?" The boy leaned closer, his whisper colder than the leather straps binding him. "This is not the first time, Doctor, nor the last. At dawn you will forget, and when night falls again, you will remember, and we will be waiting." Daniel's body trembled, his eyes wide with horror as the words sank in. This wasn't a single punishment. This was endless. The boy stepped back into the circle of patients. As one, they turned their hollow faces toward Daniel, their voices joining in a whisper that shook the walls. Forever. Daniel lay limp against the restraints, the smell of scorched flesh clinging to his skin. His breath rasped shallow, each inhale jagged as though the air itself resisted entering his lungs. He tried to lift his head, to focus, but his body trembled violently, nerves frayed from the current that had ripped through him. Yet his mind was burning with clarity, clearer than it had ever been, because now he knew the truth. This was no haunting, no illusion, no cruel trick of a guilty conscience. This was judgment, and it would not end. The patients surrounded him in silence, their hollow gazes fixed, their ruined faces illuminated in the harsh operating light. They no longer moved as individuals, no longer snarled or wept. They simply waited. A congregation of the forgotten, their vengeance not in screams but in their stillness. The boy stepped forward once more, the clipboard dangling at his side like a gavel that had already passed sentence. Daniel's voice cracked as he forced words through a dry throat. You can't keep me here. This place, it's not real." The boy tilted his head slightly, his expression neither cruel nor kind, but something beyond both, something inevitable. "Reality is not what binds you, Doctor. Memory does, and memory is eternal." Daniel shook his head violently, the restraints creaking as his body thrashed weakly. "No, I was trying to help them. You have to understand, I thought I was curing them. I thought I was saving them." The boy's voice sharpened, though his face did not change. He stepped closer, the circle of patients parting like shadows before him. "You strapped them down, told them to trust you, then burned their minds in the name of progress. You called it therapy. They called it agony. Tell me, Doctor, whose truth do you think matters now?" Daniel sobbed, hot tears cutting through the soot and grime on his face. He wanted to argue, to insist he hadn't known, that he had only done what medicine demanded. But deep down, he remembered. He had known. He had seen the terror in their eyes, heard the cracks in their screams, and still turned the dial higher. Because he had believed he was right. Because he had believed he was the savior. And now, in this endless hospital of shadows, there was no salvation left for him. The boy climbed onto the edge of the operating table, sitting by Daniel's side. He leaned close, whispering so only Daniel could hear, though every patient seemed to listen. "Every night, you will wake here. Every night the cycle begins again. You will beg, you will suffer, you will remember. And every dawn we will let you go, only so you can return. Because eternity is not fire, Daniel. Eternity is repetition." The word struck harder than the electricity had. Repetition. His chest heaved as he tried to comprehend it. He would live this night over and over, endless torment replaying with no escape. He screamed, thrashing against the straps, his voice cracking. "No! Please, I can't live it again. Please, end it, end it!" The boy's pale eyes gleamed like glass under the light. There is no end. The patients began to move now, slowly, their footsteps echoing against the tile as they encircled the bed tighter. Their whispers rose. Not words, not language, but fragments of his own past phrases thrown back at him in a dozen voices. "Hold still. Just a moment longer. This will help. Trust me." The sound pressed against his ears, louder, louder, until it became unbearable. He writhed, shaking his head, screaming against the tide of voices that were his own. Suddenly, the light above him flickered violently, the bulb buzzing, shadows surging in rhythm with each pulse. The patients' bodies blurred, their ruined faces melting into streaks of black until they became one mass of shadow pressing in. Daniel screamed again, but his voice vanished into the dark. And then, silence. The lights went out. The straps fell loose. Daniel sat up abruptly, gasping. His chest heaved as he looked around. The operating theater was gone. The patients were gone. He was standing in the hospital corridor again, its walls lined with peeling paint and shattered glass. He stumbled forward, his legs weak, his mind fractured. Maybe it was over. Maybe he had been freed. He clung to that thought like a drowning man to driftwood. "It's done," he whispered to himself. "They let me go. It's over." But as he reached the end of the hall, his breath caught in his throat, because there on the wall hung a mirror, a full-length mirror, cracked down the middle, its glass stained with age. He stepped closer, trembling. His reflection stared back at him, but it wasn't his face anymore. The eyes were hollow, the skin charred and scarred, his lips pulled into a permanent grimace of pain, the face of the patients, the face of the forgotten. Daniel staggered back, shaking his head violently. No, that's not me." The reflection tilted its head, the same way the boy had. And then, with slow inevitability, it smiled. Daniel screamed. The sound echoed through the hospital, through the night, through the endless void where time had no meaning. And somewhere in the silence after, a voice whispered, His voice, and yet not his. Forever.